we are going to dive right in to our discussion because there's a lot of topics to get to, and we only have a limited amount of time. This is a board performance review, but primarily we're going to really focus on two key areas, one being board performance, but the other being board composition. So I think we certainly have different perspectives here, and interested in hearing your remarks. So maybe just to level set, we are going to also use some data today from PwC's 2017 Annual Corporate Directors Survey that TK mentioned. We've, as he mentioned, conducted this for over 10 years, and this was just released about 2 weeks ago. So this is some of the freshest data available. So with that, I'll dive right in. I was just at a similar conference where 3 institutional investors on a panel were asked what the critical issue was for them right now, what the most critical issue was. And all 3 of them said board composition. So what we found in our survey is that year over year, board members tend to rate financial expertise, operational expertise, industry expertise, and risk management expertise as the most desirable director attributes. We did, though, however, this year see some spikes in 2 key areas. One was diversity. Both gender diversity and age diversity spiked significantly this year in terms of boards looking for more of that to add, and also expertise, perhaps not surprisingly, around cybersecurity, IT, and digital. And so that's what the overall group of 900 or so directors told us. But maybe if I can start with you, Gabby, when you think about the specific skill sets that are imperative right now for board members to think about in adding to their boards, what are they, and how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, in some ways, it's not surprising that composition is top of mind because, you know, if the overall objective is to have a board be as effective as possible, then you need to make sure you have the right people at the table and the right set of skills. And in a dynamic environment, the skills that are required are really, you know, they're changing. And so in my experience, what's been going on, at least the last, you know, couple of years, is yes, for sure, cyber and digital and IT. And so we're all talking about that and trying to, you know, kind of profile around that. I will say that's also a challenge, and it's a more nuanced conversation because, you know, what your profile was for a cyber expert 2 years ago is really different than kind of what it looks like now and what it probably look like a year from now. So we recognize the need to get them on, but it is going slower and it's more challenging. And I will say at the same time, we are also having lots of conversations about other ways of getting that expertise in the boardroom. And so in some cases it is getting a director, but in other cases it's making sure you've got the right third-party consultant or other kinds of, you know, resources. So, but for sure, digital and IT and cyber is one of the categories that I think we're all talking about and looking. A second that I've been seeing is there's a real interest in getting more expertise around understandings, the mindset of this new consumer millennial. And so I think some of that does reflect on what you're seeing around age diversity, but we are also having, I think, conversations around different kinds of marketing acumen and expertise that could also be valuable because we all understand we need to get there, but the path to that is, you know, something I think we're all exploring. And the third category that I'm seeing now actually in all my searches is because our industries are transforming so much and there's so much disruption going on, almost irrespective of industry or company, that we are very much looking for, whether it's, you know, an executive or a director, but people who have had experience successfully navigating disruption. And that turns out to be kind of a particular set of experience, and whether or not it's how people think about and talk about culture or strategy or, tech resources, but that experience is very valuable. So I would say those are, and they're interrelated, obviously, because partly what's going on with disruption is driving kind of a new consumer process and behaviors and so forth. But so those are the way I've been thinking about the kind of three new areas and how I'm seeing them play out in some of the searches that I've been working on.
Great. Alan, in your experience, working with different boards, has what your focus has that evolved over time in terms of, are you looking for different skill sets now than you were 2 or 3 years ago? How's your thinking evolved with regard to a board composition?
So I'll give you a sort of a 15-year perspective in about 2 seconds. Prior to the crisis, the sophistication of what boards were looking for boiled down to get me a really smart executive that knows how to make decisions and that can get along. I mean, I hate to say it, but that was sort of where the bullseye was. Post the crisis, people realized that boards need to have a range of diversity in terms of experience and knowledge and skills. And so I wrote a paper on this about 2 years ago called Battle Ready Boards, and the notion was to create a matrix that had some very specific, generic, universally applicable requirements, such as yours here on the left side of your chart, and then go ahead and identify those company-specific ones that are important to your organization. And then across the top, plot every one of your board members by name and give them a check mark for which of those particular requirements that particular individual brings to the boardroom. And then you put it up on the wall and you see where the hole is, not for those individuals, but for the board itself. And it's a very graphic way to see that we literally have none of this, none of this, none of this, and none of this. And then you can then come up with your game plan for how you're going to refresh or add to the board to do that. I had a very senior executive, one of the CEO of a Fortune 50 company for many years, work with me on this, and he said, it's going to be real life for me. He was on the board of a very significant global financial institution, and he said, I'm going to have to go in and tell 3 CEOs that I only have room for one of them because they're holding down 2 chairs and they all bring the same thing to this board. So I just can't have them anymore. And so having a methodology certainly creates the tool and the mechanism for you to have these conversations around creating the board with the right composition. And then again, what are the ones that are most in demand? Right after the crisis, shock, everyone wanted risk management experts. Then it started to look like, for certain industries, compliance experts. Literally to the level of specificity that I would use if I were actually doing an executive search to hire a chief risk officer. It was that focused. That's kind of passed, and now we're into tech transformation. People that have lived through taking a legacy business and reinventing it. Remember, reinventing it on the fly, posting earnings growth every quarter. How do you run an old core legacy company and yet have enough financial acumen to run that company and grow it to satisfy quarterly shareholder demands and still have enough free capital to invest in what the new company is going to look like? It's very difficult. And then the last is my favorite subject, which I think will be the number one thing 3 or 4 years from now, and that's talent experts. Leaders are not talent experts. They're leadership experts. So CEOs, I will give it to them. They absolutely are expert on leadership, I would suspect. They have very little grounding in the science of human capital optimization.
Right.
And so I think someday we're going to see talent experts as one of those top 3, like we have audit experts and we have risk experts and technology experts. Because what we are hearing from all CEOs is, gee, I wish my people could only do better and more. Well, that doesn't come from wishing. You have to do various things to optimize that talent.
So we'll mark that down, talent expertise, because what you said a little bit earlier about having a matrixed approach to disclosing, either looking at your board composition or disclosing that's how you look at your board composition, is very reminiscent of part of what the Boardroom Accountability 2.0 project is with the New York City Comptroller's Office and the New York City Pension Funds. Rhonda, can you talk a little bit about that project more generally and how its focus is on board composition?
Sure. So we wrote to 151 of our portfolio companies in early September, primarily the ones that had adopted proxy access as a result of proxy access shareholder proposals we had submitted to them. And we asked them for two things: a board attributes matrix, which included, in addition to the qualifications we're talking about now, also gender and race diversity. And we asked to speak to a member of the Nominating Governance Committee about how they think about board refreshment. And we've been having conversations since then with a number of them. I think I had the 39th one today. And we asked them to tell us how do they think about the quality of the board members sitting around their board table. You know, how do they derive the qualifications from the type of company that they are, the long-term strategy that they have, the oversight of CEO succession planning and human capital management, which we think is a skill that all companies should have, as well as the risks that are involved and the opportunities that evolve out of that. And, you know, take us from that to how you get to the qualifications, and then tell us how your board fulfills them, and then use the bios to explain where they got that experience from. So, you know, on one page we can see the overview, and then for the deeper dive we can go into the bios to see, okay, this one had this experience in their background and was able to, bring this to the board from that experience.
Right. Tracy, I guess when Florida SBA looks and evaluates board member skill sets, are there specific things that you're looking for? Are there red flags? Are there things that concern you when you see too much or too little of it? How are you evaluating it?
Yeah, sure. There's a number of things. There's so many dimensions across which we're looking at directors. You almost do need a visualization of it. And I think as investors in particular, we try to be careful of not like over prescribing what it needs to be. I mean, certainly we don't want to see a board with all CEOs. We don't think that that's enough diversity of the way that you naturally think or act. We don't want to see a board that has no gender or racial diversity. We may not immediately vote against members of the Nominating and Governance Committee, for example, for that. But we would talk to them and say, look, you've got a very homogenous looking board. What's your plan for this? And so we try not to be like really overly prescriptive, even when you get into cases like cybersecurity and IT and whatever the du jour kind of risk is, for financial institutions like, scandals at Wells Fargo and that have a lot of, depending on your industry, it has a lot of boards really scrambling to look at their composition. So we try to be flexible in what we expect them to have. It'd be great if every company has a cybersecurity expert, but things change so quickly. Mm-hmm. How can we be sure that that person's skills will evolve with what's going on? So I think as investors, we need to give the boards the flexibility and the latitude to hire consultants. Gabby had mentioned this. It doesn't necessarily have to be that the board has a fresh, current cybersecurity expert. Ideally, what we want is the entire board to have access to that information and that training from a consultant or whatever kind of provider resources, so that the board, you've got smart people who can take that risk and take that information and make good decisions out of it. So we really, we look at the performance of the company generally. We do look at the backgrounds of the people on there. When the rubber really meets the road is when there's a proxy contest and when we really have a choice amongst directors. That's when this really shifts into very sharp focus. And then I just want to make one more comment about diversity. Our fear sometimes is that because there's not as much of a pipeline of maybe women, because it's not just a problem in the boardrooms, it's a problem at the executive levels. And this is maybe, also true for racial and other types of diversity, particularly age. There may not be as many young people if you're looking for age diversity. So we got to be careful that we don't like recycle the same women into more and more board posts. I don't think anybody wants the same 10 women serving on, it's like, oh, she's a cybersecurity expert and she's a woman. We have to have her. The point should be to get more people of diverse backgrounds in, and not to like really reuse the same people. And we've seen some studies and some information anecdotally. So, it's putting us in a weird position where we don't want to have to vote against these really great qualified female directors because they're already on 4 or 5 boards. So we try to be flexible. We try to be balanced on both ends.
Yeah. I mean, part of our discussion around board composition is also a discussion of board refreshment, right? So the methods that you go about to make sure that the board is renewing itself, renewing that skill set. And in our survey this year, we tried to get at what the most effective ways were to get at board refreshment. By and far, number one was a strong focus on the part of the lead director or the board chair, followed by effective board or full committee self-evaluations. That being said, if you take a look at demographics right now, the average age of a director in the S&P 500 has increased to 64, I believe, from 62 a few years ago. If you look at the average tenure of directors, it's probably about a little more than 9 years. That's also increased. And if you look at the mechanisms for promoting board refreshment that are sort of rules-based, I mean, ultimately you have 2, right? You have mandatory retirement ages, which have gone from, 68 to 70 to 72 to 75 now in many cases. You have term limits, which only a very small percentage of companies actually employ, although you saw some mega cap companies this year, a few of them adopt term limits. But be interested from a director point of view, maybe I could start with you, Alan. What is the best way to ensure that you are effectively thinking about refreshing and acting on refreshing the board? Is it one of these rules-oriented mechanisms that force turnover, or is it something maybe more qualitative in the form of the self-assessment or the drive of the lead director or board chair?
Yeah. I think your research later on points this out. I think the numbers were that a significant percentage, above 40% or so, felt that their board needed some people to be changed, and I think the data was that 8% of board members were turned over.
Yep.
So there's a real disconnect there. And to be frank with you, look, we're all people, and this is a very personal thing. If you're a board member, and for whatever reason, your chair, your lead director, or your colleagues feel as though perhaps it's time for you to go. So turn that around, and it's a hard message to deliver, right? So as a result, practically, the rules-based approach has a lot of validity in creating a situation where the topic is being brought up based on something that they've all previously collectively agreed to as part of the charter, right? So it reduces some of that friction that would hold back that discussion. And the second is just how tough and strong is the leadership of the board. It's no different than a CEO that needs to terminate one of their direct reports who's not the person who's going to get them where they need to go. We're all people. Most people don't enjoy doing that to another person. But the fact is, you have to do what's right for the company. So I think the rules-based approach gives some catalyst for this discussion to happen a little bit more comfortably and less personally, per se. And I also think you need good board leadership.
Yeah. Gabby, from a board succession standpoint and board refreshment standpoint, something similar, or?
I fully agree with Alan that those are some of the toughest conversations to have with your colleague of however many years, and in some cases this is usually his last thing before he retires, and it can be really difficult. It's funny, when I first started being on boards, I was right after Sarbanes-Oxley 14 years ago, and I was audit chair. And at that time, being audit chair was kind of in the hot seat. And I really think being governance chair right now is kind of the hot seat spot, because I think it's not just the lead director. I think that your governance chair can really play a very important role, and one of the things that is changing right now is we are kind of in an activist environment where a lot of this stuff is is being constantly scrutinized. And I think some of that is healthy, and some of that actually facilitates having these conversations. And on our boards, we do what Ellen, has prescribed, which is really having kind of a matrix where you lay out, kind of what the current skills are, what the skills we need in 2 to 3 years out. And so that we can kind of be strategic about whichever is our search partner, kind of thinking about building a pipeline, thinking about transitioning. And so I think part of that is leadership of your governance chair, working in conjunction with, your lead director. So it's not necessarily a personal conversation. It's one that's kind of part of, a strategic plan about how we think about governance, self-governance, and making sure we've got the right, team at the table. But it is hard.
Yeah. Well, I'd be interested to see how our investor panelists view this. I mean, maybe Tracy, when you look at a board that's got a number of long-serving directors, or substantial number of long-serving directors, is that a red flag for you? Is Florida in favor of sort of limiting mechanisms for how long a director should be serving?
Yes and no. I mean, it is a red flag for us when we look at a board that has a lot of long-serving members. I think to some extent your independence can be compromised over time if you've served with the same set of people for a really long time. At the same time, you've got a lot of institutional knowledge there, and so you'd be a fool to just throw people out because it gets to 10 years down the road. I'm not a fan of mandatory retirement ages. I think it's age discrimination. I'm kind of shocked that they still exist. We tell this to companies all the time, and sometimes they're shocked to hear us say that. But I just, one person at 72 or 75 is not like another person, and it pulls the question out of me to them is, you don't need a mandatory retirement age if you're doing your job effectively and calling people that are not performing because of, let's face it, there's age-related decline issues, but not for everybody. We've got 95-year-olds that are still completely functional members of society and do business deals. Ira Milstein is a governance expert, and, he's well into his 80s. Is he 90 now? He might even be older than that. And you'd be a fool to have told him when he was 72 that he was too old to get off your board. He was a sharp, thinker at that age, and it shows a little bit of that tendency for us to operationalize things that are difficult so that you can kind of point to a rule. But I don't want to see that. I want to see companies having those tough conversations, the nominating and governance committee going out and doing it tactfully, but doing their job and saying, hey, we think it's maybe time for you to move on. We're not going to renominate you this year. It's scary to us to see the level of the results this year being so high that there's one or more members, and the 2 or more members, what was the number, Paul? Is 21%.
21%.
Yeah. 21% of people are saying in the survey that 2 or more directors need to go, and that shows. I don't know if you're tackling to me, I love signaling. You're signaling to me that you don't have a comprehensive process for good decision making. If you can't even get the people off your boards, how are you going to have the hard conversations about the strategy that the CEO is taking not being something that you agree with? The board's job is to hire and fire the CEO and to monitor the strategy, and then police your own members. So it makes me worried about those other issues. So we do look at long-serving members. We do say, are you having trouble making the tough calls of who should stay and who should go? But one of the biggest problems with the long-serving members right now is really this idea of diversity, and maybe they're not making the greatest decisions because they don't have the full range of viewpoints that are necessary.
Yep.
So.
Well,
Paul, can I just say one thing?
Sure.
Which is that, in my experience, the vast majority of the time, you know, we have a group of directors who are working hard, they are capable, they are experienced, and that's not why we need to move people through. It's because we brought them on 6 or 7 or 8 years ago when there was a set of skills and experience that were relevant. And in this dynamic environment, we need something different. So we're not like having the conversation with you, well, you know, you're underperforming. It's a different conversation. It's basically saying, you actually are doing a good job. We just don't need what you bring right now. And so that, you know, I think is partly, you know, kind of with the value of laying out a process and having kind of clarity around what as a board we need. And it's really not personal. You know, it's like this is what the organization requires.
For the good of the many.
Yeah. Well, you know, we brought up this data point from our survey this year on director dissatisfaction, and we've seen a trend grow here. We started asking a pretty, I guess, controversial question about 5 or 6 years ago on whether someone, if a director felt someone on his or her board should be replaced. We started at about 33%, so about a third of directors. This year, that number rose to a high watermark of 46% that believe someone on their board should be replaced, and again, 21% think 2 or more of their directors should be replaced. So I'll give it a jump ball here, but maybe Rhonda, I can start with you. Why do you think that is? Why do you does that number surprise you? Do you think it's a high number, and if so, why is it so high? Why would you guess it's so high?
I would like to think it's so high because of the quality of the boards and the higher governance that's going on with the boards, that they're more aware of the types of situations that Tracy and Gabby mentioned. And these are the types of discussions that we've been having. We've been asking, do you have the hard conversations where someone's no longer able to carry out, you know, the responsibilities that you originally put them on the board to carry out? You know, not necessarily because they're not doing their homework, but because the technology has changed, the geographic area has changed, you know, there have been other dynamic changes, and, you know, is there the leadership at the board level to have those difficult conversations? And until January this year, I had been on the corporate side, so I know these hard conversations are happening. And it's been very interesting in the discussions we've been having. Companies seem much more comfortable saying that, you know, these conversations are happening, and a lot of them attribute it to board leadership and to board evaluations that are robust that they have each year. So I'm not that surprised by the number, because I think there's more of a comfort level that this is the way the world, the governance world and the governance of boards are moving. And we're asking our portfolio companies to make a very generic type of statement that they actually have these hard conversations when they need to.
Yep. Yeah, the bar is certainly raised. But from a director perspective, Alan, does this number, how does this number strike you in terms of directors being critical of their peers or others around the boardroom table?
It's actually surprising to me, but I think it's great that you captured the data. Once I saw it, I went through the same kind of analysis to try to address, you know, why. And I think the issue is that business is getting harder every minute, and results get harder every minute. And so boards are feeling the pressure that CEOs are feeling around having to achieve results in a very complex global marketplace that has a pace of change that is exponential, whereby the employees and the leadership are able to process pace of change that is much more of a sort of quadratic slope.
Yep.
So as a result, every day the spread between demands and capability gets wider. And that spread, to me, is the measurement of pressure. And the closer those are, the less pressure. The wider those are, the more. So honestly, as a result, people are starting to look around the boardroom saying, boy, I wish so-and-so could pony up and deliver a little bit more to the effort here, where they may not have felt the need to think about that before.
Yeah.
So I think, quite frankly, it's a direct reflection of the complexity and the speed of business today.
Okay.
And therefore forcing board members to maybe feel a little bit more pain and therefore be more, let's call it, interested or judgmental about what everyone on that team is bringing to the party.
Yeah. So Gabby,
I was
is
just
it
gonna
speed
add-
of business or
No,
is it
it's absolutely
raising the
It's
bar?
absolutely the speed of business, and that's and all the right reasons. But in addition, we are in an environment where there's pretty these major proxy fights, and our proxy statements are being scrutinized and evaluated in ways they never have been, which is healthy. And and so I think that's also making boards think harder about it. And I do think some of that is really constructive. But we are in an environment now where there's a kind of it's a different external environment that is nudging us more
Right.
to do the right thing for all the right reasons.
Well, yeah.
Just
go ahead, Tracy.
just real quick, we should remember too that some of this might be seeming worse than it is by these values, because if you've got a member that's underperforming and the 11 other people on the board are all answering yes to this, it may not be as big of a problem. It's just that it's being recognized by multiple people in the survey.
Yeah.
And that it's a good thing that directors are being a lot more sensitive to this, because I think there's more recognition now that one guy or one person, I should say, on your board can really make the rest of you look bad. And the need for then self-preservation and then your control of your reputation will provoke you to do a good job for investors. So for us, it's like it's circular in a way, but it's healthy. It's going to compel them to make better choices, even if it's out of self-preservation. That's okay, because that's going to lead them to do a better job. But I do think somewhat it's terrible, but it's not as bad as we're thinking, because it's being reported by multiple other board members.
Okay. Well, I don't want to rain on the parade, but I would say that where would you identify this issue? I mean, the ideal place to identify that is in the board self-evaluation. All right. If you look at that 46% number that say someone should be replaced, and you actually look at board turnover last year, it was about 8% or so. So that if you think about it from a self-evaluation point of view or self-assessment point of view, we also asked, do you think that your board self-assessments are effective? And the vast majority of directors told us, 90+% said they're very effective. At the same time, we asked a similar question and said, do you feel like you can be frank in those self-assessments? And 3/4 said, no, I don't feel like I can be frank. So I guess, my question is, when you think about self-assessments, there is some good news, right? And that is, we saw an increase this year in the percentage of boards that told us that they took action as a result of their self-assessments. But how do you ensure that there's not a disconnect between what it is that directors tell us in terms of how they feel about their peers and taking action on that? And is the self-assessment the way to get there? I guess from a director point of view? My perspective over seeing this for many years is that most boards do something, and that kind of it felt like probably 3-5 years ago it was a kind of a perfunctory questionnaire that people would go through, and but they went through the process every year, and there was some value in that. But that over the last couple of years, at least amongst my peers, people that I talk with, that there is a real recognition that we need to up this, that we need to kind of look at some different approaches. On one of our boards, we decided last year to actually use a third party. And part of it was because we realized we just needed outside resources. We needed other best practices, because we knew the way we did it, and where general counsel, advised us. But so we found that enormously constructive. I think the other thing that I feel pretty strongly about is that in addition to having an evaluation of the overall board, that there's some mechanism for giving individual director assessment. Either as an opportunity to help somebody, improve,
but also, again, along the path to, making sure that you had kind of a process which then, in an orderly way, led to, refreshment and some turnover. So, I'm not entirely surprised by this, but I would be surprised if in the next couple of years, just at least based on the anecdotal conversations that I'm having and kind of this real awareness and pressure around refreshment, I'd be real surprised if we didn't see these numbers get a lot better.
Yeah. Alan, what's in your board experience, what's the most effective way to make sure that when you do a board evaluation, it doesn't get put in a drawer and done once a year, that there's a continuous improvement mindset as part of that board evaluation? What works for a good board evaluation?
Yeah, again, it boils down to board leadership, and each individual members, quite frankly, own self-awareness and level of personal confidence. So the more that those are scored high, the more likely you are that the self-assessment process is going to be robust, right, and is going to bring about the kind of frank and honest communications that then enables the board itself to start to self-analyze and decide on what changes or improvements it needs to make. The data around 75% feeling as though they can't be honest completely blows up the thesis that this self-evaluation approach is legitimate and effective. So that's concerning. Mm-hmm. We at Korn Ferry do exactly what Gabby said. We're hired by boards to do this for them. And what we hear from them is that people feel as though there's a higher level of assurance that they'll have their anonymity protected. So when they're doing it with a third party, they're more likely to say what's on their mind with a higher level of confidence that the third party is going to sanitize who said what, and not the lead director or the chair of the Nom and Gov committee, who is one of them as well. And by the way, what if your comments are about the lead director or the chair of the Nom and Gov committee? So there is definite concept around that, but let's face it, there's also a cost associated with it. It's in the six figures, and boards need to decide whether the cost-benefit analysis indicates that they ought to do it. I think there are plenty of companies that realize that if they do it periodically over maybe every 3 years, then it's a good mix.
Yeah, we've seen that generally with clients, that every 3 years seems like about right.
Good.
But one of the trends that we've seen some companies voluntarily adopt is more disclosure around their board evaluation process. I'm wondering, as an investor, Rhonda, is that something that you use? Do you want to know about the process? I guess my fear is that that language then can become too generic, and I wonder the extent to which it's helpful to you as investors. I know that a limited number of companies are disclosing more, but does that matter to you?
It does matter to us, and we are having the discussion about what type of board evaluation companies have as part of the 2.0 project. And generally, board evaluations are completely opaque to investors. They really have no sense of what they are. And so, here I tend to draw on my in-house and outside consulting experience, having done board evaluations in both roles. And so when we talk about it, I'd like to understand that there are multiple mechanisms for giving feedback on individual directors, formal or informal, so that it's not always to one person, because what if that one person is the issue? And I, don't want to see the language become boilerplate, because I think it is different by company and by culture. And I do like to get a sense that, there is some sort of list made each year of things that the board's going to work on. It doesn't need to be monumental, but I'm generally surprised if I hear everything's great, we don't need to change a thing, because that I find very surprising based on my corporate experience, that usually there's something new in the fast-changing business environment the board wants to know more about. They want to get the information from different sources, presented in a different way. So, we're looking at that type of disclosure, which we think should be helpful to investors to give them some assurance that there is a mechanism in place to talk about refreshment, to talk about the skills. And, my experience is generally, some sort of matrix is used as an attachment to a board evaluation saying, these are the skills we currently have, and, usually with tenure and other types of diversity on there, so that we can say, is this good for this point in time? What else do we need? And then, like to know that boards think about that at the time they're nominating the slate each year for investors.
Yeah. Well, I think we probably have time for one more topic. I think we wouldn't have a complete discussion of board composition without talking a little bit about diversity. So maybe, Tracy, I'll start with you here. What is Florida SBA's expectations around board diversity? How are you looking at diversity? Because obviously, you can look at it from the perspective of, gender, race and ethnicity, age, diversity of background, diversity of experience, international experience. I mean, there are lots of dimensions of diversity. How do you incorporate all of those, and what are your expectations of boards when it comes to becoming more diverse?
Yeah, and I think the overarching thing to remember with both diversity, with the topic we were just talking about with the board reflections and self-assessments is, the reason we're talking about these things is that we're trying to make a better board. Mm-hmm. And in the long run, we want good performance. And so in a weird way, you can look at the company's performance over time, and you can know if the board is doing its job effectively. So, we somewhat leave it up to the company. We want some diversity of gender and diversity of race. Each company is unique. Each industry has different requirements. So we basically try to be a little bit flexible in how we vote, but when we talk to companies, we talk about their performance. Even if their performance has been good, we can still come back and say, in the long run, you still do need maybe age diversity, whatever dimension that they're lacking, and we're willing to hear them out on why, how they're moving in that direction, why maybe it's not already been done. This is something that's actually one of the easiest conversations to have with companies right now, because there's such a push for it amongst investors. When we have engagement with companies, we don't even usually have to bring it up. They're already answering it before we even get there. So, in the long run, it's all about performance. I don't think that women or minorities magically would. In fact, there's mixed data on this, right? There's some studies that show that having a diverse board doesn't help performance, and there's some that says it does. I almost wonder if some of that is driven by the fact that good boards and companies that are making good decisions and looking at things for what they are the ones that are willing to hire minorities because or women because they're looking for a skill set without preconceived notions of what they want. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think sometimes the more diverse boards have better performance to the extent that they do because they are making rational, good decisions based on the evidence and not looking to just have a homogenous sense of themselves and have an echo chamber. So, when we're talking to companies, we really are looking for rational thought process. And if you have an all-white old man board, you really need to give us a good reason for why you're not doing something right now to change that.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's that they're checking the boxes. I just think as investors, the more that we can push on, it's very few boards now that haven't made significant progress in this area. And the more that we bring up the rear on that, the better. So.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that there's actually that much of a disconnect between investors and directors on this topic, particularly because, when we ask directors, as you can see from the data here, more than 90% believe that having diversity on the board helps bring unique perspectives to the boardroom, and 82% believe that it enhances board performance. So there is agreement there. So From a boardroom perspective, Gabby, I mean, how do you think about board diversity on your boards?
Yeah, I mean, very much as, Tracy is saying, which is that, what, in an increasingly complex world and industries, what you want is diversity of thought. You want diverse perspectives, appropriate, but diverse perspectives and experiences, because if you have like all people with the same, you're not going to have a robust discussion. So I want our board to have the most, rigorous, analytical, discussion possible, and what facilitates that is having a lot of different kinds of experience and perspectives on the board, from my perspective. I think the other reason, though, that it helps the board be more effective is I think to the extent we have had in the past kind of these clubby kind of, that makes governance harder also. When we're talking about how hard it is to ask a director, well, he lives in your town. Like I was in a situation where we had 4 or 5 directors in the same town. Made it real hard to, to talk about, time to step off. You're in the same country. So, I think that having more diversity also helps us govern ourselves better.
Yep. And Alan, maybe I'll give you the last word on diversity, or maybe we'll come back to you if we have a minute or so. What are your thoughts in terms of the work you do with Korn Ferry, but also from your board experience on better diversifying boards?
Given you are the minority on this panel.
I think Gabby nailed it.
Okay.
Next question.
Okay.
No,
so,
really.
so then I'll give Rhonda the last word then.
Absolutely.
We think it's important to have the diversity in the boardroom to avoid the groupthink mentality and the types of things that Gabby was talking about. And we think it's important to disclose it so that if the boards are talking about the fact that they want to cast the net widely to include women and people of color in their board search, what people are referring to as the Rooney Rule in the board, in board searches, that show us that you are walking the talk by disclosing it and not having us try to guess from a photo or from a name or from a pronoun who's in the boardroom, and pushing companies to do what others have done in effectively adopting a Rooney Rule in their board searches.
Yep. Okay. Well, I very much appreciate all of your perspectives. We probably could go on for the remainder of the afternoon, but I think at this point I will turn things back over to TK Kerstetter to walk us through maybe some of the questions that came through from the webinar participants.
Yep, thank you, Paul, and thank you, panel. Good job to start, and we did generate some questions here. Okay. And if I could just fire away at these. First question was, if a board and company has been successful in building shareholder value over a long period of time, do investors actually support shaking up the board by replacing long-tenured directors?
I mean, I'll take a stab at that if you like. I alluded to something similar. Just because you've had success up till now, we've talked about disruption in this industry, and if your past track record is a pretty good probability that you'll continue to do well, but there's no guarantee. I mean, we can't, as investors, just go, well, they've done so well so far, so we're not going to bother them. So, we want to do it in a way that's not heavy-handed. We're going to suggest to the board, we're going to talk to them, we're going to hear them out and get what their plan is, but we're really going to push on them that they're leaving some, I think, low-hanging fruit by not, taking the opportunity to diversify themselves. It's not a given that they're going to continue to do well. Everybody's doing well until there's a big scandal and the stock drops by 50%, right? That's when I wish we had considered having a cybersecurity expert or whatever it is. Too much. There's a rapidly changing world. Too much can happen. Good performance in the past is not an excuse.
Anything to add, Rhonda?
We do consider performance when we're looking at a long-tenured board, along with whether there's been any refreshment at all in the past several years, as well as good governance practices. So really all of those together should should ensure that you have some sort of turnover and you can still value the longstanding directors. But if there's, if the performance isn't good and there's no refreshment and there's long tenure, that's at the point where we would start considering voting against the nominating governance committee.
Okay, next question.
As well.
I'm under the opinion from others that recruiting directors that are one-dimensional, like risk management expert, cyber risk expert, or digital marketing expert, but don't have the broad breadth operating experience, haven't had great success as contributing board members. Can the panel support or debunk that belief? Gabby, we'll just quick go down the line.
Sure. I think that this questioner has a point, and while we were kind of talking earlier about, it is a real conversation. Is that skill so paramount that you really do need it as a director? Is it a skill that, we understand is in kind of an area that's rapidly changing, so that set of experiences might be obsolete in a couple years, in which case, then the conversation tends to turn more around, like bring in some outside resources and consultants before you use that dear seat, because that seat is a 7 to 10 year seat generally. So you need to be pretty confident that, one, it's a critical set of expertise, and also one that's not likely to be obsolete in a year or two. And that's harder in some of these areas that, we've been discussing, like digital and cyber.
One of the things that we also found in our survey is tracking the use of outside experts over the course of a number of years. I've heard in my interactions with clients and from the survey that, particularly in the area of IT, bringing in someone with a very deep IT expertise, but maybe not the breadth that you would hope for in other areas, they might better be served by having the board have its own independent advisor as it relates to IT. And our data shows that it's almost 40% of boards use some form of outside advisor. So it might be the case there.
How about from the investor's point of view? Either of you have an opinion?
I agreed with what Gabby said. That's why I think the matrix can be helpful, because if it's a robust one that has 10 to 12 different items, and the cybersecurity is the only one checked for that director, then at least explain to us the story of why that's so critically important to this particular company and this particular board, so we understand that. But you do run into the issue, if the board gets up to speed, you bring in the internal or external resources, then, are you setting yourself up for a hard conversation? So, we really want to hear from the company why they think, someone with one, expertise is sufficient. And it may be, we just want to understand the story behind it.
Yeah, the role of every board member, but also collectively, is for them to make good decisions. The reason we need people with these skill sets is so that they can contribute to the group's holistic attempt to make good decisions. If that person is not well versed enough in a variety of business, they're going to be dragging down the board in a way. If they don't have enough of a broad range view, then they're almost an information contributor, but not a strategy and a decision-making contributor. So yeah, I absolutely I think the better way to go there is to use resources like consultants to get that information. They're going to be more versatile and more well-versed, current. You could have somebody with cybersecurity, like we were saying 2 years ago, cybersecurity experience is now 2 years too old. So you need to use resources instead of just taking a director that's not well groomed enough, is how I would refer to that, for sure.
So we have time for one more question, and I pulled out one that I thought might be a little fun on this. And I'm going to guess that it might have been asked by an investor type with this, but it says, does any of the panel believe that the universal ballot issue will be discussed during the Trump administration? Okay. And I know that on the way out, Chairman White made a good case for universal ballot, but this individual is asking whether that will rear its head. Anybody not afraid to enter into the political realm of answering that question?
if I were a betting person, I would say it's not going to happen. But
I mean, and I'll say it should happen, because this is one of those things where even though we're, there's a political dimension to it, but at the end of the day, companies are sometimes hurt and sometimes helped by the prospect of a universal ballot. We had a company once, and I don't think I should name them, so I won't, but they were calling us during the meeting and holding the meeting open so that we could re-vote by like proxy, and because we had voted the dissonant card and supported a couple of the members on that, but had withheld, so we weren't able to cast our 11 votes or whatever it was. And they actually opened up the process and let us pick and choose from each ballot, because one of their people was going to, they knew we would support one of their people that was about to get thrown off. So it's a very complicated and convoluted process, and you can't always predict whether it's going to help or hurt you. So I think, I'm a little bit Pollyanna on things, I know this, but if you just give us the tools to make the best decisions that we can as investors, and so that we could actually, vote for 12 members. Sometimes it's going to help companies, sometimes it's going to hurt companies, sometimes it's going to help the dissidents, sometimes not. It's really just let us have the most efficient way of voting, and just, maybe hold your breath and hope that you're the recipient of something good from that as a company. You know what I mean? Like, that shouldn't be political, because it's not like it always helps one side or the other.
It shouldn't be political.
It shouldn't be. I didn't say it wasn't. It shouldn't be.
Well, Paul, Rhonda, Tracy, Alan, and Gabby, thank you very much for your contribution. I'm amazed at how fast the time goes by. I mean, it just seemed like we just started and already our time's up. I certainly want to thank the NASDAQ Corporate Solutions Group and PwC's Governance Insight Center, and particularly for their look into the research. I hope that the audience has gained new insights into board composition and diversity and board evaluations, and you certainly gave some candid responses, which we appreciate. To all those who took the time to view this in our webinar audience, thank you, and that will conclude our airing of the webinar. Thanks for joining us.